Welcome to the Million Vegan Grandmothers channel and our podcast. Today we're doing an interview with Kimmy Cushman, both Ray Kwalachuk and I, and we're talking about the plant-based treaty. The plant-based treaty has really made some beautiful headway in being able to save a lot of heads, really, by really encouraging people about the power of plants for human, earth, and animal liberation. So thank you for being here, Kimmy.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Tell us what's been happening with the plant-based treaty. What cities have been endorsed? You're very active in social media and on the ground.
Yeah, our social media is definitely there to reflect all the work that we're doing on the grounds. Maybe if I could just give like a super brief introduction to Plant-Based Treaty for people who don't know. So Plant-Based Treaty is a global grassroots movement that's working to build bottom-up pressure for a global food system transformation. So we work at the highest level of government with the United Nations, world leaders in countries all over the world. But our real work is happening at the city level. So we have teams all over the world who are creating change in their own communities. They're collecting endorsements from individuals within the community, doing education, talking to businesses and organizations, and really gathering support from people to endorse the plant-based treaty to join the global call for a food system transformation. So within our city program, cities can also endorse the plant-based treaty, which is a really great way to push governments within the state or the country to take action on food systems. But also cities have the ability to introduce policies within the city to make plant-based food more accessible and do plant-based education and really change the culture within the city. We also have a menu change program where we work with restaurants and schools to make their menus more plant-based. Basically, we're attempting to create this cultural shift towards more plant-based food through education and through policy. We've had 34 cities to date all around the world who have endorsed the plant-based treaty. Each city has its own climate food system plan in place because of the work we've done with plant-based treaty. And exactly what that looks like depends on what's within the capacity of the city. It depends on the size of the city and how strong the movement is there. So if you want to see plant-based treaty come to your city, then you can reach out to us and we can plug you into an existing campaign, or we can give you the support you need to help start your own campaign within your own city.
I'm in Toronto, and Toronto has not signed the plant-based treaty, but our neighboring city of Brampton has. And I was pretty excited about that. My plant-based doctor happens to be in Brampton. So the thing I love the most about the plant-based treaty is as we are engaging in COP summits, which is the conference of the parties, the nations that are trying to solve climate change and hitting all sorts of obstacles, the plant-based treaty is going to the municipal level and approaching cities. And that's a very simple kind of brilliance. Mayors were stepping up and saying, we believe in climate change. No matter what's going on at the federal level, we believe in climate change. More than half of the world now lives in cities, so it's a very important focal point.
Definitely. It's a really huge opportunity. And I think the reason that we focus on cities is because change can happen really fast in a city. You can really create a movement in a city, but also they serve as really great examples and inspiration tools to say, look at what's happening in West Hollywood, look at what's happening in Amsterdam, and that can inspire change in other cities. And like you said, half the world's population lives in cities. So it's really exciting to see what we're doing and what's possible. For me personally, I'm working in Boston and also New York City. I live in Boston. And so creating the campaign from the ground up has been really inspiring. And it's really amazing when you go out there on the streets and just how many people are so supportive and want to get involved in what we're doing.
You mentioned that plant-based treaty is seeking a new food system. At the COP summits, there was a lot of contention about whether phasing out an entire industry was the objective of the IPCC. And you're suggesting that there's a subset of the agriculture industry, animal agriculture, that is every bit as necessary to phase out as fossil fuels in tandem.
Yeah, definitely. We're not the only organization that's promoting plant-based food and really calling out animal agriculture as a major contributor to the climate crisis and the ecological crisis in general. Not only do we need to talk about plant-based solutions, we need a global agreement that this is a problem, because in addition to individual countries and different cities addressing it, we eventually need to get to the point where it's known that plant-based food is going to allow us to be able to feed the population and also live within our planetary boundaries.
I did an interview with Claire Mann yesterday about her book, Vistopia, but she was talking about eloquent communication. And she was giving tips on ways to approach people and never ask the word why, because then they start
Yeah.
justifying, but to keep the conversation going. So
Yeah.
when you approach people on the streets or in organizations, what are some of the ways that you do that keeps the conversation going?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. I recently learned about this concept of not asking why. I think it's really interesting to instead say, what do you think are the reasons that contribute to you feeling that way, or something like that. The most important thing is to take into consideration the audience, try to figure out what they care about. So I'll often start with a question, what do you know about the relationship between our food and the climate crisis? And start from a place of what they're interested in. Because sometimes even when you ask that question, people will say, oh yeah, I heard that plant-based food is healthier for you. Like, I'm kind of interested in green smoothies, really asking questions and starting from something that you already know that they're excited about because it's what they're bringing into the conversation. The benefits of plant-based food is so intersectional. When you talk about the animals and when you talk about water use, greenhouse gases, biodiversity, when you talk about the health impacts and the food justice impacts in terms of, feeding humans instead of feeding animals, access to healthy food, and also the rights of workers who are often forced to work in slaughterhouses. And so promoting plant-based food is the solution. Create a conversation that might be educational for the person.
Do you find these conversations about food a little bit more intense than the conversations about, say, renewable energy?
Yeah, it definitely can be. There's a lot of people who are really open-minded and want to talk about this. But at the same time, I think with fossil fuels, it's really easy to say, oh, it's someone else's problem. It's the system. There's no personal responsibility besides bike to work if I can. There's some things that we can do, obviously, as individuals to reduce our consumption of fossil fuels. But with food, it tends to be very personal because there's an insinuation that if this is bad, then you have to change your own personal behavior, which we do try to encourage people and educate people about how they can change their own behavior. But we also make a point to say we're also working on the system change to create an environment where more people can easily eat more plant-based diets, whether it's because it's more accessible and they'll have grocery stores to go to, or also, because of the price, and also just that it's around in restaurants and things like that. So we definitely try to encourage people to transition to plant-based and try new things. But we also say it's also a system problem, because even if I'm talking to you and you're going to go plant-based, that's not going to solve the entire 300 million people in the United States to go plant-based. So we're trying to encourage people to take action themselves and also support the movement to create a food system transformation so that everyone is able to eat more sustainably.
I think there's a quest for truth on the scientific level too, and there's been kind of a lag of scientific vigor and emissions from animal agriculture. Do you believe that involving more engineers that are involved in the physics and analyzing the value of food solutions, is that something that's really important right now?
Yeah, I definitely think that it's important that we can understand all the different impacts of animal agriculture, but we have the solutions. It's time to implement them. I think that there's more than enough evidence already that animal agriculture is destroying the planet and destroying ourselves and the other animals. It's always good to nail down some extra numbers, but I think even if all of the emissions and all of the effects were half as much as we think they are, it's still enough to really push for food system transformation. And that's why I'm focusing on the education campaigns, because there's more than enough evidence to say that we really need to transition to plant-based food systems.
It's interesting, Kimmy, that when I was in social work, they always would say, we're not born in a vacuum. We're not. We're part of a system, and take a little bit of pressure off the parents and what's happened to the parents within the system. And so I think systematic change is so relevant, because my daughter is not feeding my grandchildren plant-based nutrition, even though she has me in the family with lots of information. So we know that facts alone and numbers alone do not change people's behavior. We know that. What have you seen have been some of the most effective campaigns in your work?
I've been with plant-based treaty for less than a year, since about April last year. But the most effective campaigns, I think, for really getting the masses to do diet change is plant-based defaults. Like right now, it's the case that when you go to a restaurant or to a cafeteria, you say, oh, what do you have that's vegan? And they say, oh, well, we have one thing over here. And, it's going to take us an extra 20 minutes to prepare because it's in the freezer because it doesn't get ordered very often. And you're like, oh my gosh. And you have to check the menu before you go anywhere to make sure that there'll be vegan options. Whereas, what if we had a system where most of the options were already plant-based, but you could, if you really wanted to, go out of your way to get dairy milk or meat or whatever it is. This tends to be really effective because it's easier to implement a change that doesn't take away people's choice who really want to have meat and dairy. But for the vast majority of people, they just want delicious, healthy, filling food that's just right there that they can grab. It really has a huge impact on the amount of plant-based food that we can get into the public. And then obviously people trying plant-based food gives them the experience of, oh, this is really good, actually. Oh, I didn't even know this was plant-based. An example is the New York City hospital system has made plant-based defaults. So when people go into the hospital and they have to be served meals, the first option that they're given is a plant-based meal option. And if the person says, no, they don't want that, they're given a different plant-based option. And if they say, no, they don't want that, then they're finally given an option which is not plant-based. And as you might imagine, before this was implemented, very, very few people were getting the plant-based option because they had to go out of their way and ask for it specifically. But since this has been implemented, 60% of the meals served are plant-based. So there's so many people who are choosing the plant-based option because it's right in front of them. And this has reduced the emissions, obviously, of the hospitals, but also even reduced the cost of preparing the meals. So yeah, I think the plant-based default concept is so important because more people will be open-minded to it. It really has the opportunity to transform how people eat because it's really influencing the food environment in which you're making the choices.
You mentioned that we don't have an awful lot of control over our energy systems, but we have complete control over how we fuel our bodies. It's great that this municipal movement is pushing back on the notion that the political systems don't want to politicize food. They will politicize fossil fuels, but they will not politicize food. We see that especially at the national level. But as we see more cities signing the plant-based treaty, it's sending a different message. And you go back to the COP summits, and even though you're on the outside looking in and there isn't food on the table, as they say, you're making that possible and smoothing out that avenue of getting the politics to understand it can't be ignored.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it intersects with so many issues that a lot of governments really care about, even if you're just talking about health and the cost of food. There's just so many ways that you can talk about it to elected officials, and there's going to be some issue that overlaps with what they really care about because food intersects with everything that we do.
I notice in municipal politics that scope 3 emissions is where food tends to be concentrated, and it's kind of an afterthought to the direct emissions that cities and companies and corporations and institutions are wanting to green up, but food is kind of left to last, and you're helping shuffle that forward and say, let's deal with the food. It's quick and it involves everybody.
Yeah, definitely. And it's really important that we consider scope 3, which means that the emissions that are basically transported into the city. So there might not be cow farms within the city, but if people are eating beef and dairy in the city, then we have to take into account that the people in the city are driving the greenhouse gas emissions that are happening some miles away on the farms. Yeah, because we need to address all the sources of the greenhouse gas emissions.
And everybody should be following Plant-Based Treaty on social because it's a joyful movement. It's not about suffering. It's not about giving things up. It's about accomplishing something that's meaningful. And it helps us recognize that we can be part of something instead of just, voting every 4 years.
Yeah, definitely. It's really inspiring to see the social media channel because it's educational, but also it's just so cool to see all over the world that this movement is happening. There's things that, people are out in their communities making change happen. So I would definitely recommend people follow like just at Plant-Based Treaty on Instagram. It's a really good resource for inspiration because a lot of times we might feel apathetic and hopeless about the climate crisis, but there's so many people out there all over the world that are creating the change now. So we can be part of it together.
Thank you, Kimmy. And as you see on Ray's screen, our VCOP 20 is coming up on the 25th and 26th, and it's rewilding the planet. And what does the plant-based treaty have to do with rewilding the planet? Well, when we return the land that is used for animal agriculture back to the people for plants, then we have more than enough land. I think the statistics are we have enough food even to feed the world 14 times over, and so much of the land can be left to rewild. So thank you for promoting and sharing. And, I see in your bright eyes and your excitement that, you're very passionate about this cause. And so thank you for being and putting your creativity and passion into this movement. We really appreciate you, Kimmy. What will you be presenting at VCOP 20?
Me and my colleague will be giving a presentation all about the plant-based treaty, about the impacts of animal agriculture, and about how you can get involved and help making the change happen in your own community and in the broader world as well.
Great. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you so much.
Ray. Yeah, it's been a great conversation. And the joining of vegans in the idea of rewilding a planet is actually a really joyful celebration, because I love being in the wilderness and I love seeing the animals in their natural habitat. Let's do it together. Thank you, both of you.